Imagine stepping into one of the most dazzling spaces ever constructed. Versailles, the glittering jewel of 17th-century France. Chandeliers sparkled from above, silk draperies shimmered with every draught of air, and golden halls stretched endlessly. To visitors, the palace was a theater of magnificence, proof that France's Sun King, Louis XIV, ruled not only through armies and treaties but also through spectacle. But breathe too deeply and the illusion shattered. Beneath the perfume, beneath the flowers and incense, there lingered a stench so foul it seemed to rise from the earth itself. Versailles dazzled the eye while it punished the nose. And for noble women, who embodied the image of refinement and grace, that contradiction was sharper, crueler, and harder to endure than for anyone else. The strange truth is this: in a world obsessed with appearances, bathing, the very act that we would consider essential to cleanliness, was treated with suspicion, even fear. Doctors of the era warned that immersing the body in warm water opened one's pores to unseen enemies, invisible vapors and diseases that floated through the air. Bathing wasn't cleansing, it was courting death. The voice of the Catholic Church amplified this caution, portraying bathhouses as dens of vanity and sin, places where the body was worshipped instead of the soul. Slowly but surely, aristocratic culture began turning away from water itself. So what was a noblewoman to do? For most, washing the entire body simply wasn't an option. Instead, they performed a ritual of partial cleansing. A damp cloth, sometimes moistened not with fresh water but with vinegar, alcohol, even saliva, would be dabbed across hands, face, or neck. That was considered sufficient. Skin that glowed with powder and rouge might not have felt water in months. And when a true bath was attempted, it was rarely private or pleasant. Whole families might share one tub. Men first, women last. By the time it was a lady's turn, the water was tepid, murky, clouded with soap scum and sweat. If any water was left at all, it was hardly refreshing. This neglect of bathing wasn't unique to Versailles. Across much of Europe after the Black Death, people turned from the bathhouse in fear of contagion. In places like the Ottoman Empire, however, public baths flourished, where bathing was tied to ritual purity and social life. The contrast is stark. In Istanbul, a hammam was a jewel of society. In Paris, washing was almost a private act of heresy. Versailles noblewomen were trapped by the culture of their time, expected to be paragons of beauty without access to the very means of physical cleanliness. And the result was unmistakable. The air of Versailles was thick with competing scents: musky perfume, candle smoke, damp stone, sweat masked with rosewater, the tang of vinegar cleansers. Foreign visitors commented, sometimes in horror, about the palace's odor. It wasn't merely the stables that smelled, it was the people themselves. The great irony was that noblewomen, wrapped in silks, dripping with jewels, painted into perfection, were often hiding bodies that hadn't seen true soap or fresh water in seasons. From afar, divine elegance. Up close, human frailty, and more than a little sourness. If the avoidance of water shocked outsiders, what awaited them in Versailles corridors was worse. Toilets, the most basic of modern expectations, were almost entirely absent. Versailles contained hundreds of rooms and thousands of courtiers, yet had virtually no functioning bathrooms. Instead, life at court relied on chamber pots, small bowls tucked under beds, hidden behind curtains, or carried discreetly by servants. Nature's call was answered not in privacy but in improvisation. Once filled, these pots were dumped from windows into courtyards and gardens. The unlucky passerby below might receive an unwelcome baptism. Men, in particular, were notorious for their disregard. Many simply relieved themselves in stairwells, alcoves, or the expansive gardens. Courtiers joked about stepping carefully not for elegance but to avoid human waste. Noblewomen, gliding in their wide skirts along polished floors, lifted their gowns not just to flaunt embroidery but to ensure the hems did not drag through filth. Behind the facade of civility, Versailles had corridors doubling as open latrines. By 1715, conditions had grown so revolting that a royal decree demanded the corridors be cleaned once a week. Not daily, not after every gathering, once a week. This was seen as progress. The smell, however, never lifted. Ambassadors from England and the Holy Roman Empire sent back letters not only about political intrigues but about the unbearable stench of Louis's court. Perfumed rot, one observer called it, a palace where luxury was caked over waste. And still, life went on. Chamber pots clinked beneath the velvet of ladies' chambers. Windows opened, and waste arced down toward the gravel paths. Servants scurried with rags, barely denting the accumulation. Imagine arriving in the Hall of Mirrors, expecting radiant beauty, and finding your senses assaulted not by incense but by a reek that clung to the very tapestries. Versailles was, in every sense, a performance hall, dazzling from afar, appalling when the curtain was drawn back. For noblewomen, whose dignity depended upon how they appeared in such surroundings, the contradiction was particularly cruel. They embodied elegance, yet lived daily in an environment steeped in filth. And if one could not cleanse the body, the next best step was to conceal it. Thus began the obsession with surfaces, with wigs, powders, perfumes, and the elaborate artifices that came to define courtly fashion. If Versailles could not smell clean, it would at least look magnificent. But that path, too, carried its own horrors. If bathing was avoided and toilets were an afterthought, then noblewomen at Versailles turned their attention to the one arena where they could not afford to falter: appearance. In a court where status was everything, hair became not simply an adornment but a battlefield of spectacle. Hairstyles rose to absurd heights. Literally. Wire frames, horsehair padding, cotton stuffing, and layer upon layer of curled strands were stacked into towers that could stretch several feet above a woman's head. Into this precarious scaffolding were set pearls, ribbons, silk flowers, miniature gardens, even tiny replicas of sailing ships riding crests of powdered curls. It was artistry and architecture combined, but also a breeding ground for misery. The foundation of these towering wigs was animal fat pomade, most often beef tallow, which provided the necessary stickiness to mold and freeze every curl in place. That sticky fat proved irresistible to lice. Women of rank lived with entire colonies crawling through their carefully powdered crowns. Scratching with one's fingers was unthinkable, disrupting the hair was social suicide. Instead, court ladies carried silver lice claws, long-handled, ornate tools with which they could discreetly scratch between sips of wine. Imagine the scene: chandeliers gleaming overhead, violins weaving through the air, a duchess turning her head to laugh, while her hand, ever so delicately, reached up with a silver instrument to soothe an infestation. Foreign observers could hardly believe it. In England, satirical prints mocked French women as beehives filled with pests. But for Versailles, fashion was not optional, it was survival. To appear poorly groomed was to lose favor, to invite whispers, perhaps even to jeopardize one's family's standing at court. Some wigs were so heavy that women suffered chronic neck pain, others caught fire from the candles that lined every room. A careless bow could be disastrous. Yet none of these risks outweighed the greater danger: to be unfashionable. Meanwhile, poor women, spared from such burdens, often shaved their heads entirely to avoid lice. The noblewoman's crown was not a gift, but a yoke. From the hair we moved to the table, another domain of Versailles excess that concealed deep rot. Royal banquets were legendary: groaning tables laden with roasted pheasants, sugared fruits, meat pies, pastries, and exotic imports meant to dazzle foreign guests. Yet behind this abundance lay kitchens that were themselves victims of the palace's sanitation failures. Sewage pipes, primitive and overwhelmed, sometimes backed up directly into cooking areas. There are reports of wastewater spilling into the private kitchen of Queen Marie Antoinette herself. Refrigeration did not exist. Meat spoiled quickly. Fruits and vegetables, left out for days, attracted clouds of flies. Rats and mice darted freely in storerooms. Cooks did their best, but there was only so much one could do when preparing food amid filth. The consequences were predictable and grim. Diarrhea, vomiting, and intestinal illnesses swept through the court with sickening regularity. Tapeworm infections were common, with undercooked meat as the culprit. Louis XIV himself was said to have passed a 6-inch-long tapeworm, a grotesque reminder that even the Sun King could not escape the parasites lurking in his feasts. Remedies of the time were nearly as disturbing as the illnesses: swallowing mercury or concoctions of ground glass, or even bizarre cures like consuming live creatures, frogs, snakes, or cats, believed to lure the worm out. For the women of the court, meals were a delicate performance. They were expected to eat with grace, to smile, to flirt, to maintain elegance even while their stomachs twisted with pain. To lose composure was to lose face, so the discomfort remained hidden, festering behind jeweled smiles. But if banquets exposed the frailty of noble stomachs, nothing revealed the vulnerability of noblewomen more brutally than childbirth. In 17th and 18th century France, the birth of a royal child was not a private family event, it was a matter of state. When a queen or high-ranking lady went into labor, her chamber filled with witnesses. Courtiers, priests, doctors, and nobles crowded into the room, not to comfort her but to observe. The reason was simple and chilling: fear of scandal. Rumors of infants being swapped, especially if a girl was born in place of the desperately hoped-for male heir, meant that transparency was enforced through spectacle. A queen might be in agony, sweat pouring down her face, yet around her stood dozens, even hundreds, staring as though the chamber were a stage. Queen Marie Therese' birthing room was once described as more theater than medical ward. Marie Antoinette herself fainted after one such ordeal, overwhelmed by the oppressive heat and suffocating press of bodies. There was no dignity, no privacy, only expectation. And childbirth in those days was perilous. Without antiseptics or antibiotics, infections were frequent. Unwashed hands of midwives and doctors spread deadly fevers. Instruments were crude, pain relief non-existent. 1 in 3 children died before the age of 3. Many mothers did not survive either, their deaths hastened by blood loss or infection. And still, each birth was hailed as a national celebration, even as it left behind grief and trauma for the women who endured it. For the noblewoman, life at Versailles was thus a tapestry woven of contradictions. She glittered in public, but scratched in private. She dined at tables of abundance, yet battled parasites within. She bore children not in the intimacy of family, but under the scrutiny of a nation. Versailles may have been the stage of Europe's most refined theater, but its stars lived with discomforts, indignities, and dangers that strip away the fantasy of fairy-tale royalty. The silks and jewels were real, but so were the lice, the worms, and the terror of childbirth. The world remembers Versailles as the palace of mirrors and marvels, of fountains and fireworks. Yet to walk through its halls in the 17th century was to encounter not only the splendor of kings but the secret miseries of queens. History often paints them as figures of grace, paragons of sophistication. But behind the portraits and pearls lay human beings who survived amid filth, fear, and fragile flesh. Theirs was not the life of untouchable luxury we imagine, but a relentless performance against a backdrop of stench and suffering. And so, when we picture Versailles today, gleaming gold under the French sun, we should remember also the hidden reality. For the women who lived there, royal life was not a dream, but a cage of beauty and rot, where every smile concealed a secret struggle. Are you as surprised as I was? Drop a comment below, smash that like, and let's dive deeper together. Don't forget to subscribe for the next untold story.